So yesterday was the first election in Hong Kong since this whole round of protests finally kicked off. Now, this wasn't an election for the central government in Hong Kong, the one led by Carrie Lam and the one that's been under fire so much, the people who are the direct intermediaries, between Hong Kong and Beijing. However, this was still an election of all the local district councils, which frankly I'm kind of impressed that they even have such a thing in Hong Kong because, you look at American cities, our cities here are so centralized, there's no subdivision beyond that, you kind of are, if anything, as cities grow, you have much less representation in the government. So I would imagine that a huge city like Hong Kong would be terrible as far as that goes, but there's a surprising number of sort of legislative seats in these local districts and in the central government. Certainly puts to shame a place like New York, which is back in the 19th century, not to get off on a tangent, was much more like this, to where they had all these local councils spread throughout the city. And of course, New York back then wasn't a single city. New York City was just Manhattan, and then you had Brooklyn and all these other, the boroughs were their own cities. And pretty much every school had its own school board. You didn't have this centralized school board thing. But that's a part of the early 20th century reform movement that is a huge, huge topic in American history that I don't have time to get into. Now, the important point is that this election in Hong Kong, I wasn't exactly sure how it was going to go. I thought it was pretty certain that the opposition was going to do pretty well, but there was still a chance that, with all these protests and some of the violence that's gone on, there was a chance, I think, that a lot of people in Hong Kong, would have sort of retreated and wanted to not and be scared of voting for the opposition, and it could have actually hurt the opposition to the the pro-Chinese side in Hong Kong, but that didn't end up happening. People were not scared. In fact, they were emboldened more than ever to vote for the opposition. It was a huge landslide victory. All of the top parties, except for one of them, is sort of an anti-Beijing type of party. I guess they prefer to call themselves the pro-democracy folks, although I'm sure if you ask the folks in Beijing, they say they love democracy too. China says that they're the world's largest democracy, which is pretty funny. But, in effect, whenever any government talks about democracy, that's just their way of saying, any government that we happen to like. It's just like in America, the American government will call other governments that they don't like undemocratic. And then, they'll call a military coup, a restoration of democracy, like in the case of Bolivia. So to me, if you're a political organization and you say that, oh, you're pro-democracy, to me that just, it sounds like an empty platitude. But hey, they seem to at least be more pro-actual democracy than the Beijing folks. So the so-called pro-democracy side ended up winning about 57% of the popular vote. Now, of course, the popular vote is not what decides the composition of the legislature because it's, I believe these are single-member districts. So they won 57% of the vote and a lot more than 57% of the seats. In fact, they won 388 seats out of, I believe, 452 that were up for election. I think there's more than 452, but only 452 were being contested. And so the pro-Beijing folks apparently ended up with only 62 seats. So it's an overwhelming supermajority in these district councils for the anti-government people, or I guess you could say the folks who are critical of Beijing. They officially, none of these parties are particularly radical. They officially still support, staying a part of China, all of that. These aren't independence parties by any means. They are typical, center-left liberal parties that, some of them I believe are, not even ostensibly in favor of social democracy. Some of these are even still, economically rather liberal parties. But people who believe in free speech and, one man, one vote, that sort of thing, I guess you could say they're kind of classical liberals, which were also, on the left back in the 19th century, although I doubt that they're nearly as radical as the classical liberals of the olden days. And of course, there's also a lot of social democrats mixed in there that think that the communist government in Hong Kong is not communist enough, which I guess from a left-wing perspective, it's pretty easy to make that case, since they did keep Hong Kong relatively close to how it was under the British, which was not particularly left-wing economically at all. And so obviously this I don't know if you can call it an upset, because I don't think it was necessarily unexpected, but this landslide victory is a huge shift from how things went the last time. The last time around, the pro-democracy folks only won about 40% of the popular vote, so that's about a 17% difference, and they only won 126 seats in the legislature. And you compare that with the pro-Beijing folks, who won 54% last time of the popular vote, almost as much as the pro-Democrat folks won this time, and they had 298 seats. So things have flipped on their head, and the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, but it swung even farther than it had before, towards the anti-Beijing folks. Now, something interesting was that, getting back to the parties that make up this pro-democracy coalition, I've been hearing from left-wingers in the United States, some people who I respect, folks who are good at following what's going on with American foreign policy and trying to call out color revolutions and things, meaning sort of astroturfed rebellions that are fomented by the CIA to overthrow governments that the U.S. doesn't like. They've been sort of making that case about the Hong Kong protests and saying how, these are far right protesters, and the Hong Kong protesters, they have no legitimate grievances against China and all this, and they've been kind of, in my opinion, being really soft on China to the almost to the point of shilling for them. And so since they've been saying, hey, this is a right-wing movement, these guys are, anti-Mandarin racists, or anti-Han racists, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe there's some point to this, so we'll wait for the election and see, hey, are there any far-right parties that got in? Are there any Cantonese nationalists in here that want to, create some, create an independent Hong Kong, or perhaps create an independent Hong Kong that is a forward operating base to build an independent Cantonese state? No, there's nothing like that. There was, from I could tell, no nationalists elected, at least not in wide numbers. Perhaps there might be an individual, politician here or there who has some pro-independence sentiments, but most of these guys, their official line is still pretty moderate. And, I would imagine that most of these parties, on principle, would appeal more to left-wing people than right-wing people. So I don't really understand so much why the left in the West, a lot of them are so, against the protests that are going on. Sure, I'm sure the CIA is funding it, because the CIA funds all protests, but that doesn't mean that all protests are necessarily wrong and invalid because the CIA backs them. I mean, not all protests are astroturf. Some protests are legitimate, and the CIA is going to support them either way, because that's what the CIA does. The CIA will help anyone who is hurting their enemies. And so just because, like, if I were in Hong Kong and I didn't like my government, you shouldn't blame me and call me a CIA stooge because the CIA happens to agree with me. If I were in that position, my grievances with the Chinese government would have nothing to do with the CIA. It would not be because the CIA is, telling me to have those opinions. There are a lot of reasons not to like the Chinese government. And so, getting back to the protests, I guess the protests did a pretty good job promoting the cause of the opposition, and they certainly did not apparently make the opposition look bad in the case of the, in the eyes of the general populace. Because apparently, even I was reading, even some of the richer areas, the ones that would be much more averse to things like popular uprisings and things, people who do not want, the natural order of things in Hong Kong to be disturbed, even those areas were voting pretty heavily in favor of the opposition relative to last time. So I guess the protesters are doing a good job making themselves look righteous and just. And if anything, this is just sort of a validation of everything they've been doing. It shows that what they're doing is working, in that they are building support amongst their fellow countrymen. Hey, they have legitimate demands, and that the government is not so great. And so after this, I think the wind is at their backs for the protesters, and I think things are going to continue heating up in Hong Kong. It'll be very interesting to see what happens the next time that the government, the central government of Hong Kong, is sort of up for re-election. Now, from what I understand, they have somewhat of a limited franchise in Hong Kong. So I'm not entirely sure how that will go. It might still be heavily slanted towards, the pro-Beijing folks. But nevertheless, even if the government is reelected, which, again, if this district election is any indication, then the government of Carrie Lam certainly will fall. But if they are somehow reelected, I think we'll probably still see a significant shift away from them, even if there is some sort of limited franchise that helps them stay in power. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.